Module 2 of Williamson County Schools Cultural Competency Series. Our goals for today are to discuss the nature of bias in schools, including some of the unconscious ways that educators may practice bias. We'll also work to empower Williamson County Schools educators to seek learning opportunities to increase self-awareness. As in the previous module, these norms will help facilitate culturally competent conversations. Please make a conscious effort to listen first, being intentional about affirming the lived experiences that your group members may choose to share. When we attempt to multitask by using electronics during discussions, it's easy to disengage. Please put your distractions aside so we can all focus on these important topics. This is not a solutions-oriented session. We will maintain a focus on individualized growth. Since you're grouped with educators from across the county today, please try to form a small group with people from a different school. This will help us connect in new ways and will provide insight about approaches outside of our buildings. It's important to this work to share our reflections. So when a question is posed during the module, please discuss the question with your small group. Please ask one group member with access to a computer to record a summary of the small group's discussion in the Google form. Your content specialist or facilitator for today can provide you with a link to the Google form. In Module 1, we heard from different voices across the county about why cultural competency matters to them and took time to discuss efforts in our schools. We also discussed what makes a student vulnerable, and as many of you indicated, vulnerability is something that is constantly changing and is something that's difficult to define. We reflected on classroom structures and setup, school-wide practices, and our interpretation of curriculum and ways we can increase cultural responsiveness in these areas. I want to thank you for the time and effort you put into the responses. The almost 400 responses submitted will provide critical guidance in planning for the future. Overall, you provided thoughtful and detailed responses. We also had over 100 teachers indicate that they would like to be more involved with cultural competency at the school or district level. You really emphasized that a culturally responsive mindset is a priority for you, and that you appreciated the discussion that you had with colleagues. Before we begin talking about today's topic, I'd like to take a moment to revisit the multiple levels of understanding that the word culture suggests. Culture, in a broad sense, goes far beyond country of origin, race, or even ethnicity, and can include the total way of life of a particular group of people, including systems, attitudes, beliefs, and feelings. In Module 1, we discussed some aspects of culture that are easy to see, hear, and understand. For this module, we will look at culture in a deeper sense and focus on attitudes, concepts, and ways of communicating that may be so deep in our cultural programming that we're not necessarily always conscious of them. This subsurface level of culture truly defines how individuals and groups make meaning out of the world. Understanding our own deep culture is the key to beginning to examine how we interact with others, especially those whose values, behaviors, attitudes, and approaches may be different from our own. These interactions are rooted in how our brain responds to perceived differences. As scientists, including Horacio Sanchez, have researched, all human beings have bias, and most of our biases are a combination of natural brain-based responses, social constructs, and our lived experiences. Since much of our implicit or unconscious bias cannot always be articulated, we sometimes resort to defensiveness or denial. An example would be claiming race neutrality or color blindness. This mindset denies the reality that racial bias does exist and that racial identity can be an important and profound part of one's culture. Not all bias is bad. In fact, our ability to sort and categorize difference was an important survival mechanism for early humans. Bias becomes a problem when it leads to prejudicial behaviors, including stereotyping certain individuals or groups. Simple snap judgments that offer a single explanation for a person's appearance or actions can be misleading and damaging. To begin to look at how we can avoid biased beliefs and behaviors in the school setting, let's hear from some administrators and teachers about the presence of bias in our classrooms.
Bias is so big to kind of talk about, right? So I'm going to think about some different beliefs I consider, like maybe how someone grew up, or maybe some like structural things like in the school, like beliefs about kids' ability levels and things like that, or like those are those kind of kids. So, that will, they might struggle, or they'll definitely need some more support and things like that, right? And so I think, while those things can sometimes be like well-intentioned, it's still, I think, we have to check our biases a lot of times because, we're surprised, and I think we limit our kids a lot of times when we have those biases in place.
I think beliefs about inferiority of other races based on preconceived notions. People may think that their race is more superior or more smart or intellectually inclined, and other races are not. So then it kind of makes sense why this student who's a black or brown kid is struggling with this topic, because of those preconceived notions that certain students do well, certain students excel academically.
I think teachers have certain expectations for certain cultures, and they I don't think that they can do this because of either their culture or because of their race. And I feel like if teachers don't find where their ability level actually is and just saying, well, they can't do this, then it's not fair for the kid.
I think at times, again, we want to make all our kids kind of conform to whatever box that we want them to sit in. Like, you need to be sitting this way, you need to be doing that, and you need to be doing this. Like, parent involvement needs to look like this, and kids should be doing that, should be saying that. And whenever those don't fit into our conform box at times, I think that it can be, we start to sort of see our bias.
And I hear a lot, people will say like, oh, that particular group is like this, except I know some exceptions to the rule, and this is my friend who's an exception, and this is my friend who's an exception. So, but I think bias is so easy to fall into, even if you care not to. Like, even if you don't want to have that kind of bias, it takes a lot of active effort to stay out of practicing biased behaviors.
It's time to discuss and reflect as a small group. For 10 minutes, please talk about these two questions. What are some beliefs that may lead to biased thoughts or behaviors in schools? How do our own backgrounds or childhood experiences create potential for biased behavior? At this point, I will invite your group leaders to pause the video to allow for 10 minutes of discussion time. At the conclusion of your discussion, please ask one group member to record a summary of the group's thoughts in the shared Google form. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with your small group. Now let's hear from some voices across Williamson County about their lived experiences with biased thoughts and behaviors. Here's something to think about as you listen. Are there ways in which teachers put pressure on students to conform to dominant cultural norms?
Everything that we do is centered around our culture, our Williamson County, culture that we have here. And so if you're not from that culture, you don't identify with that, that culture, then it's really hard to necessarily feel a part of that, right? And I think as educators, teachers, admin, cleaning ladies, whatever, I think it's our job to help our students know and that their culture is important, who they are is important, and they don't need to conform to our our culture in that capacity. Like they need to feel not only free to, but like almost like encouraged to be who they are, and not kind of be put into that, you know, that box.
And then I was thinking of like, well, that's not me. But then I have to like kind of check myself and be like, well, even though that's not me, like that has happened in the past, and I can be someone that can help.
It would be embarrassing to admit that I practice bias, but it's probably true that I have. I've definitely like made an assumption that like a person seems to represent a certain culture, so I'll assume they like a particular kind of music, or, you know, and, you know, sometimes I've been right and sometimes I've been wrong. And it's possible that somebody wasn't performing to a high enough standard, and I thought I didn't follow through well enough with that particular student. Maybe based on some kind of like an unconscious bias where I maybe would have followed through more strongly on a student who, I don't know, who I had some reason to believe needed me to. Mm-hmm. So I'm really trying to check that in myself. One thing you can do is first by creating a safe space in your classroom, and then the kind of relationship where you can really encourage communication from the student and then really listen. And not just like, especially if it's what I don't want to hear. You know, if a student gives me a feedback that that maybe they think I'm being biased, and I don't like really, you know, take more time to really think about whether it's possibly actually true that I am biased in some way.
Here are some ideas to consider when working to eliminate bias in the classroom. Examine your expectations. Bias can influence our judgments about student ability. Stereotypes of Asians as math prodigies, Black students as lazy, or Hispanic students as apathetic are pervasive and toxic. While we may not consciously stereotype our students, it is important for teachers to make sure they are using non-bias measures to make decisions and are able to guide students in setting their own goals when possible. It is important to avoid negating cultural identity by claiming to be racially or culturally neutral. Instead, use cultural responsiveness as a lens through which we can leverage student assets. Using coded language like ghetto, thug, or even helicopter parents can fuel biased behavior and unintentionally reinforce stereotypes. It is important to be careful and precise regarding word choice when communicating with students and their families. As we seek to diversify our curriculum and connect with students from diverse backgrounds, we run the risk of tokenizing or appropriating cultural identity. For example, assuming that a person from South America has ever tasted a taco or an enchilada is a way we might tokenize or appropriate Latino culture. It's important to always seek to honor the lived experiences of our students and find ways to integrate authentic cultural experiences into the classroom. Remember that connecting with culture on a deeper level means moving beyond surface-level symbols like flags or foods. Creating a space of social and emotional safety is crucial to the mindset of cultural competence. Part of the beauty of this safe space is it creates the opportunity for shared inquiry and learning. When cultural missteps occur, don't brush aside the opportunity to increase your understanding for the future. Part of being culturally responsive is to recognize that there's always more to learn. This is part of the commitment to being intentional about assuming personal responsibility for examining your own biases and collaborating with others to eliminate bias practices. Finally, the best way to work towards eliminating bias is to continually engage in self-reflection and self-assessment. You can write a list of your beliefs or experiences that may lead to biased thoughts or behaviors towards others, or journal about your interactions with others to identify areas of bias. You could even ask a trusted colleague to share their views about what they observe in you that may be interpreted as bias. Finally, you could seek out and advocate for the inclusion of anti-bias learning opportunities at your school. We will end today with some final thoughts from teachers and administrators. As you listen, please consider what personal commitment you're willing to make to examine bias in your personal and professional life.
We all have bias, and whether we know it or not, we need to stop and reflect, whether it's journaling or just thinking about how the day went and thinking about how you might have had some sort of bias. And it's uncomfortable, and you're putting yourself in a vulnerable spot. And I don't know, when I do it, I feel really guilty, oh, I can't believe I did that, or I wish I wouldn't have done that. But once you know it and once you recognize it, you can work with it and fix it if you know that it's something that you can do.
And I would challenge, us as a county, as admin, as teachers, as educators, who care about all of our kids, to, what are we doing to actively, stand against structures that aren't supportive of all kids.
The whole entire system is kind of stacked against the ability to really keep bias out. So all we can do, I think, is be conscious of it and try every day to be sure that you're self-reflecting.
It's important for us to analyze this because it's important to the kids. I grew up in a school district that was not as diverse. I was used to being the only African-American student in most of my classes up until I got to high school. So for the students, these are issues that they're struggling with, that they're having to come to terms with. So imagine the difficulties of just growing up and puberty and all of that and making friends. Then on top of that, you feel othered in your classroom because there aren't any other people that look like you, and everyone's asking about your hair and do you get a tan and all kinds of crazy questions because they're kids too, trying to figure it out. So as adults, the same way that we're teaching them academics, we're also teaching them about life and what it's like to be a human. So if we have the opportunity to improve the trajectory for any student, we should do that.
I have definitely reflected on being in Williamson County a lot and how little contact I have with kind of a variety of all kinds, of people. And so I've been spending more time also reaching out to people I know to find out what I can learn.
It's important to identify what your biases are, do some soul searching and self-reflecting, and and figure out how to overcome those and set those aside and try to the best of your ability. And we all have them, we all have bias. So just thinking about how I can, I don't want my bias to inform my decisions or opinions on people so much to where I'm blinded by it,